Shout out to Bring Our Q, Julius, you legend. We're going to do a joint interview, yeah? Yeah, we'll do a joint interview, Julius. Thanks for the support. You're a legend. From your girls, Raven and Ellie.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news. Ow!
Okay, we'll start with this. Ahead of her upcoming junior middleweight debut, trainer, manager, and promoter extraordinaire Steffi Bull posted this to his social media with a caption that reads, "No catchweight agreement, no rehydration clause, just a little lightweight turning up into the 154-pound division to become a two-weight world champion. Insights into the match. Insights into the contest." I wonder if the Rankin people had reached a agreement with the Terry Harper people for perhaps a catch weight or a rehydration clause, something to balance things out and even the playing field, it being that Terry Harper spent a good chunk of her career campaigning at or around super featherweight. More recently, she debuted as a lightweight at 135 pounds, and this is quite a leap. She's leaping past 140, past 147, all the way up to 154.
I saw an interview this week with Steffi Bull
where he talked about why Terry's making this move. What was the school of thought when this decision was made? And he talked about how it just didn't make sense for Terry to keep cutting down all the way down to lightweight. Not if it wasn't going to be for a title. And all the titles at 135 pounds, they're held by Katie Taylor. Katie and Terry, they're in very different places in their careers, and Katie's targeting other fights with other fighters. Terry's not on her radar, so why keep cutting down to 135 pounds if you're not going to fight for a title? In so many words, that's what Steffi said.
And I figured that the world title situation between 130 and 147 pounds is a part of why she's making this move.
They already established that Terry could no longer make 130 pounds safely, that she outgrew that division, so she moved up to 135, but there ain't no titles to fight for at 135, not unless you're on the eve of getting a Taylor fight, which Terry is not. At 140, it was very recently announced that Chantel Cameron will be taking on Jessica McCaskill for the undisputed super lightweight championship. And even before that,
we were waiting on Kaylee Reese to take on Chantel for the undisputed super lightweight championship. Essentially, the titles were all spoken for. There were none available to fight for.
None at 135. None at 140, and none at 147. Jessica McCaskill, who was very recently in action in defense of her alphabet titles against Mexico's own Alma Ibarra, she was spoken for before, and she is spoken for now. She's fighting Chantel. So between 135 and 147, there were no available alphabet titles to fight for, but at 154...
Now you're cooking with rice.
One of the more interesting tidbits of Steffi Bull's interview was he mentioned that Terry, all this time, may have very well been campaigning at the wrong weight. You know, Terry's not a big woman per se, and she's not top heavy, but she's always had noticeably big quads.
She's got big legs, and you know what they say, power is drawn from the ground up, a solid base.
And that's what Terry Harper's got. Is it possible that all this time, Terry Harper's ideal weight was perhaps somewhere in between 135 and 140, maybe even as high as 147. 154, I think that's pushing it. With fighters, unbeaten ones, like Mary Spencer.
She'd make Terry look like a super flyweight. She'd make Terry look like a shrimp.
Rankin is the naturally bigger woman in this fight. And next to someone like Mary Spencer, even Rankin would look small. So they are pushing it. They are pushing the envelope, daring to be great, as they say. I think Terry Harper better batten down the hatches because she's in for a shitstorm.
I think Rankin likely has that Alicia Baumgartner knockout in mind, and I think she's going to be aggressive.
And for what it's worth, Rankin is a characteristically aggressive, mid-range to inside fighter. She's not a defensive lateral movement, back foot kind of fighter. She normally takes it to her opponents, and against a naturally smaller opponent moving up in weight who may not necessarily have enough power to keep her off or keep her out.
Hannah's strategy might very well be to take it to Terry and rough her up.
The silver lining, as it were, the saving grace for young Terry Harper is that she's always been a characteristically athletic fighter. She can move. She's got good feet that may help her manage the distance in this contest where she is the naturally smaller fighter. And she is naturally smaller, but that may result in a speed advantage to where maybe she can't overpower Rankin.
But she does have faster feet, and faster hands, so maybe she can beat her to the punch.
Whilst managing the distance, moving and punching, careful not to get sucked into exchanges. That's what Hannah Rankin wants. Hannah's got slower feet. She's more flat-footed.
She wants to pin down Terry Harper, set those feet, and let the fists fly.
Perhaps overwhelm Harper with volume. Perhaps score a knockout like Alicia Baumgartner did 2 fights ago. That might be what Hannah Rankin is thinking.
And because there are no catch weights, no rehydration clauses,
And Hannah Rankin has had ample time to prepare. She's had a full camp. Both fighters have seen action within the last 12 months. There are very few intangibles here.
oh yeah, it's gonna be a good fight, it is, but it's ballsy.
Very ballsy from Team Harper. In men's heavyweight news, Frank Warren tabs Joyce Dubois as favorites in a fight with Anthony Joshua. A likelihood fights that don't happen given the rest of what old Fish Eyes had to say. Get a whiff of this. There's some good domestic fights, which are world-level fights for him. Joshua, here in the UK, Warren told Seconds Out. There's Joyce, there's Daniel Dubois. There's some really good fights there to be made, which I think the public would buy into. And I would make both of them, Joyce and Dubois, the favorites over Joshua, when it was pointed out that those fights would probably have to take place on DAZN, given Joshua's contract with the streaming platform. Warren disagreed. They wouldn't, would they, Warren said. He being Anthony Joshua, is the B-side of the card now. He's not the A-side anymore. He's the B-side. He's the guy who lost 3 of his last 5 fights.
Yes, I won't lie to you. Losing to Alexander Usyk, it hurt Anthony's marquee value a bit, it did.
But not so much that either Joe Joyce or Daniel Dubois would be the A-side fighters over him, because Frank Warren, he knows how this works just as much as I or you, and he knows underneath it all, Anthony's got a bigger following than either of those fighters that he promotes, and because of that following, he brings a certain value to the table that they just don't. And he's been promoting the both of those boys for a long time, and neither one of them have yet amassed the kind of following that Anthony Joshua has amassed domestically. Consider that the most he can do for Joe Joyce is fetch him a guy that Anthony Joshua fought 2, 3, maybe 4 years ago.
Joyce-Parker.
Do you think that Joyce versus Parker is going to do commercially, and at the box office, and at the gate? Do you think that fight's going to do what Joshua versus Parker did?
Come on, you know the answer. And so does Frank.
Never mind Daniel Dubois, a boxer he let end up on a Don King show. Christ's sakes, Daniel had to take Don King to court just to get the rest of his purse. Does that
sound like the kind of thing that happens to an A-side fighter?
You're saying that Daniel Dubois and Joe Joyce are the A-side fighters to Anthony Joshua, but A-side fighters in what way? Certainly not at the box office, certainly not at the gate. Those guys have never made the kind of money that Charles Martin made just for boxing Anthony Joshua 4 or 5 years ago. Those guys have never sniffed the kind of money that Andy Ruiz made fighting Anthony Joshua, or the money that Usyk just made. These guys are not the A-side fighters.
Even off of 2 consecutive losses, these two ain't the A-side fighters to Anthony Joshua. It's not even close.
You've got Joe Joyce boxing Joyce-Parker on a pay-per-view later on this month, and coincidentally, night of that same fight, Lee Wood's going to be taking on Mauricio Lara.
Let's pretend that's not going to cut into your sales.
The fact that you have 2 shows happening in the UK, 2 domestic shows, and one of them is a pay-per-view, and one isn't. Both cards are great cards, and here in the United States, we're going to be able to see the both of them for free. But over there in the UK, those Brits, they're going to have to pay for one of those shows, and let's pretend that that's not going to cut into your sales.
So you could be making anything semblant of a point. Joe Joyce and Daniel Dubois ain't the A-side.
Oh, Frank, you're just taking the piss.
Come on.
You've been trying to duplicate Anthony Joshua and Eddie Hearns' success for years. Case in point, you've got Joe Joyce boxing a guy that Anthony beat already years ago, and you've got Daniel Dubois doing the same thing. He's rumored to be facing Dillian Veit.
You're feeding those boys Anthony sloppy seconds, and you think they're the A-side over him?
I think Frank can get Joe Joyce to an alphabet title, the WBO title, because he's already in line to fight for it if and when it becomes available, if it is vacated in the near future. I think Frank can get him that, but even with that, that's not going to make him the same draw that Anthony Joshua still is.
It's not. Frank's always had a way with the WBO, and that's all well and good, and you can get him that title, but that won't make him Anthony Joshua.
Especially not at 37 years old. In case you're not aware, Joe is several years older than Anthony. He ain't got all the time in the world to build a huge following.
It might sound like I'm stating the obvious, but Here's what isn't so obvious.
Frank is essentially resisting reality, resisting the idea that Anthony Joshua, even now, off of 2 consecutive defeats, he's resisting the idea that he's the A-side fighter to his fighters. And in so many words, what he's telling you is he's not going to send those boys over there for an Anthony Joshua fight, even though that's the only way they can get it. And they won't make the money with anyone else that they could make fighting Anthony Joshua. That's essentially what Frank is communicating. If you want to play these fucking games, because that's what they are.
You want to play fucking games.
Play games. Play those fucking games. And see if that puts comparable money in Joe Joyce's pocket or Daniel Dubois' pocket, playing these fucking games. Because if anyone's being shortchanged by all of this, it's the fighters.
I don't think Joe Joyce is scared of Anthony Joshua. I don't think Daniel Dubois is either, especially now they probably view Anthony as low-hanging fruit.
They probably do, off of 2 consecutive losses to Alexander Usyk, but the disconnect here is that neither one of you two's boys is Alexander Usyk.
Nope.
You're nothing like him.
Nope.
And if you're creating a situation to where your fighters won't make that concession, won't acquiesce to being the B-side to what so obviously is the A-side fighter, if you're not willing to make that concession, you're not willing to acquiesce, then those fights, they don't happen. There's only one way to get Anthony Joshua in the ring for those boys, and that's knowing your role for the opportunity. The opportunity to beat him, obviously, and the opportunity for a better purse than you can get with anyone else.
Better know your role. Know your place.
You ain't box office, and neither is a Dubois kid. If he were, how the hell did he end up fighting on the Don King show in Florida?
Is that what happens with Frank Warren's top draws? They end up as part of Don King shows.
Those fights don't happen. Anthony Joshua fights exclusively on DAZN per his contract, which he signed ahead of the second Usyk fight, that dictates he fights exclusively on that platform. And he does generate more interest. He does generate more revenue than Daniel Dubois and Joe Joyce do combined. So if you're not willing to cross the street to fight him, if you're not willing to acquiesce, then you don't get the fight.
What do you think, you hot shit because you're ranked #1 at the WBOA Newsflash?
You might very well be in a pole position to fight for the brown belt when the time comes, but they've got a guy over there who's in a pole position to fight for the red one, Filip Hrgovic.
What do you think, that because you got some kind of interim situation going on at your box office?
That makes you about as much the A-side to Anthony Joshua as it makes Filip Hrgovic the A-side to Anthony Joshua. Don't kid yourself.
Even if Frank might
kid himself. No concession, no fight.
No fucking fight!
You want to play stupid games? You'll win stupid prizes, and that'll be one of them. You'll be shortchanged out of the biggest fight you could be in the domestic UK boxing scene, because Anthony Joshua is still box office. Make no mistake. And upon his return, that's what the numbers will show. That Frank's just blowing smoke up everybody's ass.
And it'll cost you millions if you let him blow smoke up yours.
Better wake up and smell the coffee. And just in keeping with the theme of all things heavyweight, particular to Queensbury, Frank Warren's boys, Parker, Joyce's demand for a rematch clause shows a little weakness.
Well, those are the perks of being the house fighter and the guy who's got everything to lose.
Smoking Joe Joyce may not be the A-side to an Anthony Joshua, but in this situation, he is the A-side to a Joseph Parker. I know deep down, I back myself 100% to beat anyone, Parker told ID Boxing News. I want to beat Joe Joyce first, twice. I have to beat him in September, have a rematch, and beat him again. Then I'm free to fight anybody. He's not even champion, so he shouldn't have a rematch clause. But it's one of those things where they weren't going to make the fight happen unless it was in place. I don't need a rematch clause. For the Joshua fight, I didn't need a rematch clause because I backed myself, and I back myself now. I think it shows a little weakness because the first time we negotiated with them, they didn't care about a rematch clause.
If Joe Boxer Parker upsets the apple cart for Joe Joyce,
they will be all tied up with each other going into the year of 2023, keeping the path clear for the undisputed title fight between Alexander Usyk and Tyson Fury without any pesky mandates by way of the WBO, at least. I didn't look the best in the first Cesaro fight. Then after the second one, they wanted a rematch clause. It shows weakness and shows there are little doubts that they think they might lose.
That's interesting. So they decided not to go with that rematch clause until after the second Cesaro fight.
I'll tell you something. I don't really like Joseph Parker's chances in this thing. Joe Joyce isn't a streamlined or nuanced fighter. There's a lot to pick apart when it comes to seeing Joe Joyce in action, but you know what you're getting. You're getting a physically imposing heavyweight who's going to come forward and throw punches and bunches, and he's not going to stop. And I've said it before, I'll say it again, here, now. I don't think Joseph Parker has the killer instincts to keep this guy off him, and I don't think he's so concussive a puncher that he can stop Joe Joyce.
Joe Joyce, who's had a chip on his shoulder the whole buildup of this fight.
Seems very confident, and I can't say I blame him. This isn't an aged and war-torn Derek Chisora that will be opposite the ring, Joseph Parker. Joseph Parker needed 2 fights with a war-torn Derek Chisora to pull off one decisive victory. Just one. He'll be facing a lot more than that in Joe Joyce very soon.
Let me tell you, he couldn't close the show with Derek, so he's going to close the show with Joe?
I don't think so. I don't. This is being billed as a Queensberry Promotions BT pay-per-view, and this is happening the same night as Lee Wood versus Mauricio Lara. As stated, I think that's going to cut into this pay-per-view's sales. It might, because the UK boxing fan will have a cheaper alternative that same night. More importantly, it's becoming increasingly difficult to sell pay-per-views in this day and age with the inception of VPNs and free streams and various different websites, methods to watch a fight for free.
It's not just the Lara versus Wood fight happening the same night as this fight that might cut into its sales.
And don't forget, Joseph Parker, former champion and capable boxer that he might be, he's got the personality of a paperweight. He's got the personality of warm oatmeal. Fat fucking chance of selling this one behind the trash talk between the two fighters.
Back when Anthony fought this guy 3 or 4 years ago, it was Anthony's drawing power that sold the fight.
And it sold a little over 1 million pay-per-view buys domestically. It did good at the box office, it did. But that was behind Anthony Joshua's star power, the kind of star power that Joe Joyce doesn't have here today. This thing ain't doing 1 million pay-per-view buys. I don't think it comes anywhere near that number.
Which, in many ways, is unfortunate, because it is a good card and it is a good fight, but neither one of these guys got that kind of following. They just don't.
It would be quite the statement if Joe Joyce could become the first man to stop Joseph Parker. I mean, that really would be saying something, because Joe's fought a lot of people, but he's never been knocked out.
He's been knocked down. He got knocked down by Dillian Whyte. More recently, he was knocked down by Derek Chisora early in their first fight.
He's been knocked down, but he's never been knocked out.
Could Joe Joyce be the first to do it?
Well, you know what they say. There's a first time for everything.